The massive imperial palace loomed over the capital world of Centauride Prime, its crystal spires reaching toward the purple sky like sharp fingers trying to tear the clouds. Inside these walls, Emperor Stone ruled over 10,000 worlds with an iron grip that hadn't loosened in 3 centuries. Tom Gray stood at the window of his tiny office in the diplomatic wing, watching the 3 suns set one after another. He was the newest and lowest-ranking member of Earth's diplomatic team, and the only human who had bothered to study more than just the basic required imperial languages. "You're still here." The voice belonged to Blue, one of the tall crystal-like beings from the Frost worlds. Like most non-humans, Blue used a simple name that others could easily pronounce. The day cycle ended an hour ago. Tom turned from the window, offering a polite bow that he knew the crystalline diplomat would appreciate. "Just finishing some translations. The Emperor's latest decree has some interesting language patterns." Blue's crystalline form shimmered with worry. "You spend too much time studying the Emperor's words. It's dangerous. We deliver the messages, we follow the protocols, we do not analyze." The creature's lights pulsed faster. The last diplomat who tried to understand too much disappeared. But Tom couldn't help himself. As Earth's leading expert in alien linguistics, he had noticed something that others had missed. The Emperor's formal speeches, delivered in the official high speech of the Empire, contained subtle variations that nobody else seemed to recognize. "Look at this," Tom said, pointing to his screen. When the Emperor addresses the water-breathing species, the rhythm of his words changes. It's like he's trying to match the flow of ocean currents. Blue moved away from the screen quickly. "Please, friend Tom, such observations should not be spoken aloud. The walls have ears, as your people say." At that moment, the entire palace shook. Red emergency lights flashed through the corridors, and a booming voice spoke in high speech. "All diplomati CSTAFF, YLATTND the Grand Howl. Immediately." Tom felt his heart race. This was only the 3rd time in his 6 months here that the Emperor had called an emergency gathering. The last 2 times, entire planetary systems had been punished for what seemed like minor protocol breaches. He joined the stream of different species hurrying toward the Grand Hall. Tall insectoids clicked nervous messages to each other. Floating gas beings pulsed with worried colors. Even the normally stoic rock people seemed to be trembling slightly. The Grand Hall could hold representatives from all 10,000 worlds, but today only the 100 or so diplomatic staff were present. They arranged themselves in perfect rows according to their rank and species, with humans near the back due to their recent addition to the Empire. The Emperor's arrival was announced by a deep horn that made the floor vibrate. Everyone dropped to their designated submission poses. Tom pressed his forehead to the cold floor like everyone else, but he kept his ears open. Emperor Stone's voice filled the hall, speaking in high speech. But Tom noticed something unusual. The Emperor's words carried a pattern he had seen in ancient texts, a rhythm used in times of great stress or worry. "The Sector 7 delegation has failed to maintain proper protocol." The Emperor's words boomed through the hall. "Their worlds will be sealed off for 1 standard year. No trade. No communication. Let this be a reminder." Tom listened carefully. Behind the harsh words, he could hear something else. The Emperor wasn't angry. He was afraid. The subtle shifts in tone, the specific choice of ancient formal phrases, they all pointed to someone trying to maintain control out of fear rather than pure cruelty. As the diplomats were dismissed, Tom's mind was racing. He had to know more. While others hurried away from the Grand Hall, grateful to escape the Emperor's presence, Tom lingered behind. He watched the towering figure of Emperor Stone return to his private chambers and made a decision that would either change the Empire forever or end his life. He would learn the Emperor's true language, no matter the cost. In the weeks following the Grand Hall incident, Tom spent every free moment in the Imperial Archives. The massive library contained records from across 10,000 worlds, but he focused on just one section: historical recordings from the Emperor's homeworld. "Records show you've spent 48 hours here this week," said Red, the archive keeper. Unlike most of her kind, she seemed curious rather than afraid of Tom's research. Her spider-like form moved closer to his desk. What could be so interesting in these dusty old files? Tom rubbed his tired eyes. "Listen to this," he said, playing an ancient recording. The words were in an older form of high speech, but the rhythm was completely different. This is how they spoke on the Emperor's world 300 years ago. Red's multiple eyes blinked in sequence. "It sounds warmer somehow." "Exactly." Tom leaned forward excitedly. "The modern high speech is like a mask. The real language underneath is full of emotion and meaning. Every rise and fall in tone carries a message." A shadow fell across their table. Blue stood there, crystal form dimmed with worry. "The diplomatic council is asking questions, Tom. They want to know why you're researching forbidden histories." Tom started to answer, but alarms blared through the archive. All screens lit up with an imperial announcement. 3 more worlds had been sealed off for protocol violations. "This has to stop," Tom muttered, downloading more records to his personal device. "The Emperor isn't just punishing people randomly. He's responding to perceived insults that nobody else understands." That night, in his small room, Tom made a breakthrough. He found patterns in the Emperor's speeches that matched ancient greeting ceremonies from his homeworld. What everyone thought was anger was actually a formal way of expressing disappointment. The harsh commands were really calls for understanding, spoken in a way that had made sense 3 centuries ago. "Computer, compare these patterns," Tom commanded, spreading his findings across multiple screens. Ancient ceremonies, modern speeches, and diplomatic incidents began to line up in perfect order. A soft chime announced a visitor. Tom quickly hid his screens, but it was only Red. She skittered into the room, all 8 legs moving nervously. "The council knows," she whispered. "They're saying you're trying to learn the Emperor's private language. That's forbidden knowledge." Tom nodded. "I know the risk, but look at this." He showed her 2 recordings side by side. When the Emperor sealed off those worlds today, he was using the same tones that his ancestors used to express sorrow, not anger. Red's eyes widened. "You mean he's not terrorizing the galaxy? He's following customs that everyone else has forgotten. When diplomats break simple protocols, to him it feels like they're deliberately insulting ancient traditions." A loud knock interrupted them. Blue's crystalline form glowed from the doorway. "Tom, the council demands your presence. Now." Tom quickly gathered his research materials. "I need one more day, just one more day to prove what I found." "You don't have a day," Blue warned. "They're calling it treason." Tom looked at his screens, at the patterns that had taken months to understand. The Emperor wasn't a tyrant. He was the last keeper of traditions that had been lost to time. Every harsh decree was really a desperate attempt to maintain connection with his cultural heritage. "I can't stop now," Tom said firmly. "Red, take these files somewhere safe. Blue, tell the council I'll be there soon." His friends hesitated, then nodded. They understood what he was risking and why. As they left, Tom began composing a message in the ancient formal style. If he was right, it would either open a door that had been closed for centuries, or seal his fate forever. He had finally learned to speak the Emperor's true language. Now he just had to survive long enough to use it. The crisis began with a fight over water. The ocean world of Deep Blue had stopped sending their required water shipments to the desert planets of the burning sector. Within hours, both sides were threatening war, and the diplomatic hall had turned into chaos. Tom watched from his corner as representatives shouted in high speech, their voices echoing off the crystal walls. The desert people's scales rattled with anger, while the ocean dwellers' fins flashed warning colors. "Enough." The Emperor's voice boomed through the chamber. Everyone fell silent and dropped to their submission poses. Everyone except Tom, who was carefully watching the Emperor's face. The massive screen behind the throne showed both worlds. Deep Blue was covered in stormy oceans, while the desert planets glowed red with heat. The Emperor's face darkened as he looked at the reports. "The ocean worlds have broken their treaties," the Emperor declared in high speech. "They will be." Tom's eyes widened. The Emperor's tone wasn't angry. It was the same pattern used in ancient times when asking for explanation. But no one else seemed to notice. The Ocean Dwellers' leader spoke up. "Great Emperor, our waters are dying. The shipping lanes hurt our deep creatures. We cannot." Silence. The Emperor's voice cracked like thunder. But Tom heard the hidden meaning in the ancient patterns. The Emperor wasn't commanding silence. He was expressing deep concern. Blue appeared at Tom's side, crystal form dimmed with worry. "The Emperor will seal off both sectors. Billions will suffer." "No," Tom whispered. "He's trying to understand. But everyone's too afraid to explain properly." He watched as more diplomats arrived, each speaking in the stiff, formal high speech that had developed over centuries of fear. The desert representatives were now threatening to steal water by force. The ocean dwellers promised to sink any ships that came near their worlds. With each threat, the Emperor's posture became more rigid, his words more formal. "He's trying to follow the old ways of making peace," Tom muttered, flipping through his research notes. "But nobody remembers how to answer correctly." Red skittered up to them on her 8 legs. "Tom, do something. You understand the patterns." But before Tom could move, the desert delegation broke protocol. Their leader stood up, a forbidden act in the Emperor's presence, and pointed accusingly at the ocean dwellers. The throne room went completely silent. Even the air felt frozen. Everyone knew what was coming. Breaking protocol meant punishment. Entire worlds would be sealed off. Billions would suffer for one person's mistake. The Emperor rose to his full height, his shadow falling across the room. His voice carried the weight of centuries as he began the formal words of judgment. Tom's hands shook as he looked at his notes one last time. The Emperor wasn't speaking in modern high speech anymore. He had switched to something much older, the same patterns used in the ancient crisis meetings of his home world. "He's not going to punish them," Tom whispered. "He's begging them to talk to him properly." Blue's crystal form flickered with fear. "Tom, don't." But Tom was already moving. He stepped into the center of the room, breaking every protocol that had governed imperial meetings for 300 years. Diplomats gasped. Guards reached for their weapons. The Emperor turned his ancient eyes toward Tom. The human stood straight, took a deep breath, and began to speak. Not in high speech, not in the formal language of diplomacy, but in the ancient tongue of the Emperor's own world, with all its subtle tones and deep meanings. "Great One," Tom said in the old language, "let me show you what both sides are trying to say. Let me bridge the gap that time has created." The room fell so quiet that Tom could hear his own heart beating. The Emperor's expression changed from shock to something else, something that no one in the room could read. Except Tom. Because he spoke the Emperor's true language, he saw what no one else had seen in centuries. The Emperor was smiling. Guards surrounded Tom instantly, their energy weapons humming with deadly power. The diplomatic hall held its collective breath. No one had directly addressed the Emperor in his ancient tongue for centuries. "Hold." The Emperor's command stopped the guards in their tracks. He leaned forward on his massive throne, studying Tom with eyes that had seen centuries pass. "You speak the old words." Tom fought to keep his voice steady as he continued in the ancient language. "Yes, Great One. I have studied the ways of your world, the true meanings behind the words." Blue tried to move toward Tom, but other diplomats held the crystal being back. Everyone knew that interfering now would mean death. The Emperor's voice carried a tone that made the guards step back. "How?" These patterns were lost to time. Not lost, Great One. Hidden in the archives of your own palace. Tom gestured to the arguing delegates from the water and desert worlds. Just as the true meaning of their words is hidden behind formal speech. A low murmur ran through the crowd. No one had ever seen the emperor in such a long conversation. Usually, he spoke only to give commands or pronounce judgments. Dangerous knowledge, the emperor said, rising to his full height. He towered over Tom, his ceremonial armor gleaming under the bright lights. The last one who tried to learn our ways died 3 centuries ago. Tom nodded. I know. I found the records. But he tried to use the knowledge for power. He paused, choosing his words carefully in the ancient way. I seek only to rebuild bridges that fear has broken. Red moved carefully to the edge of the crowd, her multiple eyes fixed on the scene. She held Tom's research files, ready to show proof of his work if needed. The emperor descended the first step of his throne. The entire room took a sharp breath. He hadn't left his throne during a diplomatic meeting in living memory. Tell me then. The emperor's words carried the subtle patterns of a formal challenge. What do you hear in their words that others do not? Tom turned to face the desert and ocean delegates, who were trembling in their submission poses. The water dwellers use tones of deep sorrow when they speak of their shipping lanes. In the old language, this means they seek compromise, not conflict. The emperor descended another step. And the others? The desert people's formal complaints carry the ancient pattern of desperate need, not anger. They don't want to fight. They're trying to express the suffering of their people. The emperor now stood on the same level as Tom, something that hadn't happened with any diplomat in 300 years. The guards looked at each other nervously, unsure whether to maintain their threatening stance. You risk everything on this understanding, the emperor said softly. The words carried the same pattern used in ancient times for testing a student's wisdom. Tom straightened his back. Yes, because the empire risks everything by not understanding. Each world speaks differently. Great One. They try to use high speech, but their own languages, their own ways of thinking, shine through. Blue's crystal form flickered with a mix of fear and hope. The diplomatic council members whispered among themselves, trying to understand what they were witnessing. The emperor's next words silenced everyone. Prove it. Tom bowed in the ancient way, not a submission bow, but one of respect between teachers. Allow me to translate not just their words, Great One, but their hearts. Let me show you what fear has been hiding all these years. The emperor returned to his throne, but his posture had changed. The formal stiffness was gone, replaced by something that hadn't been seen in centuries, genuine interest. Speak then, the emperor commanded, using a tone that Tom recognized from ancient recordings. It was the tone used by ancient rulers when granting a voice to a trusted advisor. Tom turned to face the delegates, knowing his next words would either save billions of lives or end his own. Tom stood between two worlds. To his left, the ocean dwellers waited with their shimmering fins trembling. To his right, the desert people watched with scaled faces that showed both hope and fear. Great One, Tom began in the ancient tongue. Let me show you how they truly speak. He turned to the ocean dwellers. Tell me of your waters, not in high speech, but in your own way. The lead ocean diplomat looked confused, their fins rippling with uncertainty. The emperor watched silently from his throne, his ancient eyes missing nothing. Speak as your heart moves you, Tom encouraged, using the old pattern that meant truth above form. The ocean diplomat's voice came out like flowing water. Our deep ones sing in pain, great emperor. The heavy ships, they stopped, afraid of breaking protocol. Continue, the emperor commanded, but Tom heard the gentle tone beneath the word. The ships cut through ancient breeding grounds. Our young cannot hear the songs of their elders through the noise. We don't wish to break treaties, but we're watching our future die. Tom translated, carefully matching the emotional patterns of the ancient imperial language. The emperor's eyes widened slightly as he heard their pain expressed in his own tongue's deepest forms. Then Tom turned to the desert people. And you, speak with your heart's heat. Their leader's scales shifted from fear gray to truth red. Our children thirst, Great One. The water we receive is life itself. Without it, our ancient gardens are dying. These gardens have passed from parent to child for 10,000 years. As Tom translated, he wove in the ancient patterns that spoke of heritage and legacy. The Emperor's posture changed subtly, showing he recognized these sacred concepts from his own world's history. Blue watched from the crowd, crystal form glowing brighter with each successful translation. Red held the research files tightly, but they weren't needed now. Tom was doing what no one had done in centuries. He was making people truly understand each other. The ocean people offered to build new shipping lanes, Tom continued, if they can preserve their breeding grounds. He turned to the desert delegation, and the desert worlds would accept less water if they were sure it would never stop completely. The Emperor rose again, but this time everyone saw something different in his movement. It wasn't the stiff formal pose of power, but the fluid motion of his ancestors. "You speak truth," the Emperor said in the ancient tongue. "Both sides fear for their future. Both protect what is precious. This is not defiance. It is devotion to their ways." Tom bowed slightly. "Yes, Great One, as your people were devoted to your ways." These patterns survived in high speech, but their meaning was lost in fear. The Emperor descended his throne completely. The guards stepped back, understanding that something historic was happening. "Speak to them in my voice," the Emperor commanded. "Tell them what I could not." Tom turned to both delegations. In high speech, but with the ancient patterns woven in, he translated the Emperor's true message. "Your ways are your strength. Your differences are not flaws. The Empire needs both the depths and the deserts." The delegates looked up in amazement. For the first time, they heard not judgment or command, but understanding. The Emperor moved to stand beside Tom. In the old language, quiet enough that only Tom could hear, he said, 3 centuries I have waited for someone to remember. To understand." Tom replied in the same ancient whisper, "Understanding never truly dies. Great One, it only sleeps until someone awakens it." The Emperor nodded, then spoke to all in a new way. High speech with the ancient tones of wisdom rather than command. "The ocean worlds will redraw their shipping lanes. The desert worlds will receive their water. And both will teach us their ways, as we should have learned long ago." The diplomatic hall erupted in sounds of joy. Blue's crystal form shone like a star. Red's 8 legs danced with happiness. Tom stood quietly, watching as centuries of fear began to melt away, one word at a time. 2 months after the historic meeting, the Imperial Palace had changed. The once silent halls now echoed with different languages, each carrying their own special way of speaking. Tom stood in his new office, much larger than his old one, watching diplomats from 20 different worlds practice the ancient patterns of imperial speech. Blue helped by showing how crystal beings used light to add meaning to words. Red demonstrated how her people used leg movements to express deeper feelings. "The Emperor requests your presence," announced a guard, using both high speech and the old patterns. Tom smiled at how quickly even the palace guards had learned the new way. In the Emperor's private study, charts and language records covered the walls. The Emperor stood before a giant screen showing hundreds of worlds, each glowing with different colors. "Look," the Emperor said in the ancient tongue as Tom entered. "The ocean worlds have finished their new shipping lanes. The desert worlds report their gardens are growing again. And neither side needed our threats to keep their promises." Tom nodded. "Understanding breeds trust. Great One, trust breeds peace." The Emperor turned from the screen. "But we face a new problem." He pressed a button, and more worlds lit up on the display. Every sector wants to learn the old ways now. They all want to speak as their hearts move them. "Is that a problem?" Tom asked carefully. "It is an opportunity," the Emperor replied, using the ancient pattern that meant challenge bringing growth. "But we need more bridges, more people who can hear the truth behind different ways of speaking." Tom understood immediately. "You want to start a school. Not just a school. A new way for the Empire to work." The Emperor's voice carried excitement that would have been hidden in formal high speech. Each world will send people to learn not just our ancient patterns, but all patterns. Each species' way of speaking holds wisdom we lost to fear. Blue appeared at the door, crystal form glowing with news. Great One, the Water Brothers have discovered patterns in their songs that match your ancient tongue. Enter, the Emperor said warmly. Show us. Blue played a recording of underwater songs. The rises and falls matched perfectly with the Emperor's oldest language records. Similar discoveries were happening across the Empire as people finally felt free to share their true ways of speaking. Red skittered in next, all 8 legs moving in a pattern that Tom now recognized as formal excitement. The desert people's heat dances, Great One. They tell stories just like your world's ancient ceremonies. The Emperor nodded, pleased. Gather the diplomatic council. It's time to make these changes official. In the Grand Hall, Tom stood beside the throne as the Emperor addressed thousands of representatives. The massive chamber, once silent with fear, now hummed with different species talking freely. For 3 centuries, the Emperor began, speaking in both high speech and the ancient tongue. We let fear build walls between us. Today, we begin breaking those walls. He announced the creation of the Imperial School of Cultural Understanding. Every world would share their ways of speaking, their patterns of thought, their special kinds of wisdom. And to lead this new beginning, the Emperor continued, we named Tom Gray as first speaker of many tongues. Tom stepped forward, bowing in the ancient way. Then he did something unprecedented. He asked the Emperor a question in front of everyone. What made you trust me that first day, Great One? The Emperor's answer carried the warm tones of his ancestors. You spoke not to command, but to understand. Just as my people did, before fear taught us to hide behind formal words. Blue, Red, and the other diplomats murmured in appreciation. They had all learned to hear the deeper meanings now. Tom looked out at the gathered representatives. Water brothers, crystal beings, desert people, gas forms, and 100 other species. Each had their own way of speaking. Each held wisdom to share. The age of fear was ending. The age of understanding had begun. 5 years had passed since Tom first spoke the Emperor's ancient language. The Imperial Palace, once a place of whispered fears, now buzzed with life and learning. In the grand open courtyard, Tom watched students from 1,000 worlds practice their lessons. A group of fire beings floated gently, learning the Water Brothers' songs. Crystal people like Blue taught desert dwellers how to speak with light and color. Red spider folk showed gas forms how to dance their words. First speaker, called a young human diplomat, running up to Tom. The new students from Earth have arrived. Tom smiled. Earth had changed too. Once seen as newcomers to the Empire, humans were now known for their gift of learning other species' ways. Their natural curiosity, once feared, had become their greatest strength. Take me to them, Tom said, using 3 different language patterns at once, a skill that had become common in the new empire. The Emperor was already there, greeting the Earth students personally. No longer hidden in his throne room, he now spent his days moving among his people. His ancient eyes sparkled as he watched the newcomers practice their first words in his ancestral tongue. Remember when everyone feared these meetings? Blue appeared beside Tom, crystal form glowing with amusement. Now they compete to be chosen. Red skittered up, carrying teaching records on all 8 legs. The success rate is amazing. 95% of Imperial worlds now resolve their problems through cultural exchange rather than formal complaints. Tom watched as a young Earth student perfectly copied the Emperor's ancient greeting pattern. The Emperor's pleased response carried tones that would have been hidden under formal high speech just 5 years ago. You've created something remarkable, the Emperor said to Tom, switching to private speech patterns. Fear ruled us for 3 centuries. Understanding freed us in 5 years. Tom bowed slightly. We all created this. Great One. Every world had wisdom waiting to be shared. They just needed permission to speak their truth. Around them, the evidence was clear. The school of cultural understanding had grown into a movement that transformed the empire. Every world now had its own cultural center where people could learn each other's ways. Trade disputes, once solved through threats and punishments, were now handled by speakers trained in multiple cultural patterns. Even the Imperial Guard had changed. They were now protectors of understanding rather than enforcers of fear. "Tell me," the Emperor said, using teaching patterns, "what is your proudest moment from these 5 years?" Tom thought carefully. "Not the big changes," he replied, "but the small ones. Like yesterday when I saw a desert child teaching a water breather their heat dance patterns, or last week when crystal beings learned to sing with gas forms." Blue's light patterns showed agreement. "The children don't even remember the old ways now. They grow up speaking many tongues, understanding many hearts." Red raised her front legs in the formal pattern of sharing wisdom. "The archives are full again, not with fearful records of punishments, but with stories of different worlds learning from each other." The Emperor nodded, his ancient eyes seeing far. "For 3 centuries, I tried to preserve my world's ways through power. You showed us how to preserve them through sharing." He switched to the oldest pattern, the one used for deep truth. "The Empire is stronger now than it ever was under fear." Tom looked out at the courtyard full of learning, at the palace walls now covered in artwork from 1,000 worlds, at the spaceports busy with cultural exchange ships rather than guard vessels. "This is humanity's gift to the stars," Tom said softly. "Not our technology or our strength, but our desire to learn, to understand, to build bridges." The Emperor smiled, using an expression he had learned from humans. "No, Tom Gray, this is all worlds' gift to each other. You just reminded us how to give it." Around them, the sounds of 1,000 languages mixed freely with laughter and friendship, creating a symphony that would have been impossible in the old empire. Fear had ruled for 300 years. Understanding would guide them for thousands more.